What is a special education? The relationship between poverty, race, and disability by Addie-Grace Cook. 1. Introduction. The two sides of special education. When they separate you into different classrooms, it can just debilitate you. Mark Nelson. In his special education classroom in Monrovia, California, Mark Nelson felt his dream of going to college slip away one day at a time. It wasn't that Nelson's work was too difficult for him to complete. In fact, it was the opposite. One day, the teacher simply read out the test answers to the class as though she was doing them a favor. Nelson spent high school almost exclusively in a special education classroom, feeling himself fall behind, but without any tools to change that. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, a student named Brad could barely respond to short answer questions assigned to him in a general education class. Brad's mom explains, teachers didn't realize how much trouble he had with reading and writing and that he was falling behind. They assumed he didn't want to do the work. Without accommodations or services, Brad flew under the radar, doing his best to complete assignments. Across the country, special education is failing students who are caught in the dichotomy of a system that doesn't provide adequate services for some, while dangerously lowering expectations for others. Both sides of this system fail to respect the dignity and well-being of students within it. Some students are treated like they cannot complete the work assigned to them, while others lack the supports they need to learn. Mark and Brad are actually pretty well off compared to many other students in special education. Students enrolled in special education services are more likely to be incarcerated, not finish high school, develop depression, and misuse substances. Only 65% of students with disabilities graduate high school on time, compared to 83% of students without disabilities. Of the students that go into college, 1/3 will graduate within 8 years. However, the disparities do not end with academic outcomes. While 9% of the general education population experiences abuse, the figure jumps up to 31% for students with special needs. Such results pose the question, is special education harming the very students it was created to support? While they often seem invisible in schools, 15% of the student population enrolled in U.S. public schools receive special education services. While special education affects 7.2 million American children and their families, it is difficult to learn more about this demographic group's well-being. Schools are not required to release information about family income in regard to special education. We do know, however, that students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds are more likely to experience learning and developmental disabilities. 2. Defining disability and special education. Before investigating the relationship between intellectual disabilities and poverty, we must first define and understand the general system of diagnosis and treatment. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, guarantees students with disabilities the right to a free, appropriate public education, FAPE. IDEA defines child with a disability as a child who has an intellectual disability, a hearing impairment, a speech or language impairment, a visual impairment, a serious emotional disturbance, an orthopedic impairment, autism, traumatic brain injury, another health impairment, a specific learning disability, deaf blindness, or multiple disabilities, and who, by reason thereof, need special education and related services. In the diagnosis process, IDEA defines special education as specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. However, not all students with disabilities are eligible for special education. Using standardized tests, observation, questionnaires, and curriculum proficiency measurement, evaluators determine a student's eligibility. Once a child is identified as qualifying for special education, the parents, teachers, and school administrators create an individualized education plan, or IEP, together, which includes goals and objectives for the student, along with applicable accommodations, supports, interventions, and services. Special education contains 3 placement types: full inclusion placement, partial inclusion placement, and substantially separate placement. Full inclusion placement refers to plans in which 80% or more of the student's school day is spent with non-disabled peers. Partial inclusion placement includes students who spend between 40% to 79% of their time in general education, while students in substantially separate placement spend less than 40% of their time with non-disabled peers. IDEA states that students must spend the maximum extent appropriate in general education classes, which is the least restrictive environment, or LRE, possible. Educators must walk a fine line in diagnosing and creating plans for students with disabilities, as special education provides students with critical services, supports, accommodations, and legal rights that help them succeed in school. Yet, at the same time, special education identification can result in lowered expectations from teachers, limited access to general education curricula, and stigma. The system of special education in the United States assumes that all parents have time to spend hours planning for IEP meetings, poring over financial documents, obtaining behavioral testimonies, and researching therapies and programs. Caring for someone in special education is a choose-your-own-adventure novel when you expected the author to write the ending. 3. The correlation between disability, poverty, and race. Poverty, race, and disability are related in 3 main ways. The effects of poverty may cause an individual to require special education. Secondly, a student's race or poverty might result in them not receiving needed special education services and accommodations, lowering their chances of success in an education or employment later on. Finally, an individual's poverty or racial identity might result in them being placed in special education when they do not need services, causing them to fall behind, succumb to low expectations, and have a lower chance of graduating and getting a job in the future. Both under-identification and over-identification of students result in negative outcomes discussed in the introduction, such as high rates of incarceration, depression, and substance misuse. These outcomes can lead someone into poverty, thus starting the cycle over again. How can poverty bring about the need for special education? Navigating the world of disability is difficult enough with all of the resources available to a person. With the addition of low socioeconomic status, the weight of a diagnosis is even larger. Being born into poverty releases an individual's likelihood of enduring adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, such as economic hardship, having an incarcerated parent, or witnessing neighborhood violence. When a family is experiencing financial poverty and does not have adequate financial needs, they are more likely to lack quality health care, live in a neighborhood where there is violence, and go without mental or behavioral health services, all of which may engender traumatic or adverse experiences. Students who experience 4 or more ACEs have been found to be 32 times more likely to be diagnosed with learning or behavioral challenges. A disability can also increase or exacerbate a family's poverty. Parents may need to pay for equipment, specific child care programs, and transportation. In addition, the care and supervision required may restrict a parent's ability to work and cover the costs of care. Research by G.T. Fujiwara in 2000 supports the claim that poverty and disability are intertwined. Fujiwara found that 28% of disabled children were reported to live in poverty, compared with 16% of non-disabled children. Families who had a child with a disability were 94% more likely to report having cut or skipped meals due to money. How can poverty affect special education identification? Research by Laura Shifter et al. Explores the disparities in the identification and placement of students based on their socioeconomic status in 3 different states. As stated above, schools do not have to release income status in their special needs program data, so Shifter defined low income as 185% below the federal poverty line, as that determines a child's eligibility for a free or reduced price lunch. This research shows that in 3 states, low-income students were at least twice as likely to be identified as having an emotional or intellectual disability. Shifter's research also suggests that a disparate placement for low-income students. State A had the smallest gap, with 1% more low-income students being placed in substantially separate classrooms than non-low-income students, whereas in State B, there was an 11% gap. Furthermore, In State B, 4.2% of all low-income students are educated in substantially separate special education classrooms. That rate is 3.5 times higher than the rate of 1.2% for all non-low-income students. In these classrooms, expectations for success tend to be lower, education outcomes tend to be worse, and stigma associated with special education is higher. While it is important to understand how the effects of poverty may cause an individual to need special education services, accepting the disparity in special education as solely the effect of income allows educators, researchers, and policymakers to ignore potential systemic biases that may also result in higher rates of identification for special education. How does race affect special education identification? By the numbers, minority students, especially Black students, are more likely to be identified for special education than their white counterparts. Researchers, however, are split over whether this is an overreporting or an underreporting. Paul L. Morgan and George Farkas introduced their findings regarding the underrepresentation of Black students in special education in a New York Times editorial, "Is Special Education Racist?" In the study, Morgan held all factors but race constant, such as differences in children's academic achievement, behavior, gender and age, birth weight, the mother's marital status, and the family's income and education levels. Morgan partly explains this underrepresentation by the fact that Black children are more likely to live in low-income homes than white children. He also contends that Black children are far more likely to be exposed to the gestational, environmental, and economic risk factors that often result in disabilities. If a student does not receive needed services, they will not be able to progress in school with their peers and are less likely to have positive educational outcomes. Furthermore, they are more likely to be labeled as a problem student or a bad kid, which can in turn be detrimental to their self-worth and perception of themselves. As this happens more and more with Black students, educators begin to develop stereotypes and preconceived notions of the actions of Black students and may treat them differently. How can history help explain these disparities? The racial disparities in the identification and treatment of developmental disabilities date back to the 1960s, in which Black students joined schools that had been racially and socioeconomically homogeneous. If a white student struggled in school, they were deemed to have a learning disability. Meanwhile, a Black student grappling with the same topics would be labeled mentally retarded and culturally deprived. The special education system became another method of segregation and separation, creating two different narratives for the causes of disability. As researchers continued to study disability and lawmakers wrote special education policy, the ideas of different types of disabilities grew. A 1967 report claimed low-income African American children were deprived and neglected. Middle-class suburban children were overstimulated and pushed beyond their abilities. While things have certainly improved since 1967, the stories told about white students and Black students still differ. One, a story of defiance, maleficence, and the influence of a bad neighborhood, and the other, a tale of an overactive imagination, extra time on tests, and trouble focusing. 4. Possible solutions and conclusions. To better serve low-income students and students in special education, schools must first review their policies and practices, re-examining the ways they interact with special needs families and students, organize classrooms, hire educators, and integrate services. Districts should obtain outside expertise to implement training on disability identification that includes considerations for linguistic and cultural differences. A culturally informed evaluation process would result in less misidentification and bias towards minority and low-income students. Schools should also focus on making general education more accessible and supportive for all students. At the federal level, lawmakers should amend IDEA, requiring schools to release data on socioeconomic student status within special education so that researchers may better understand the connection between poverty and disability. The research suggests that poverty, race, and reported disability are interrelated. Because they can affect, influence, and aggravate each other, it is often difficult to distinguish the causal relationships between these factors. It is most important to note, however, that there is not just one explanation for the disproportionality of Black and low-income students in special education, or for the disparities in classroom placement. Scientific studies must be designed to have a narrow focus to find exact correlates, but social issues cannot be viewed narrowly. It is imperative that we read the research, consider it, and combine it with more research and narratives from people actually experiencing the issue to gain a more nuanced and complete view than a singular data set will ever allow. It is a great travesty to lose the people within the scientific process, which is why we must always be cognizant of the problems and inherent limits of studies and pay attention to the perspectives and ideas of those experiencing the problems.